Well, good evening. First of all, I want to just thank you for taking time to be with us this evening. This is prime time, right? I mean, there's good stuff on television. There are things you could be doing, but you're here, and so thank you for taking time out to join us. We lured you here, if you saw our Facebook ad, we lured you here with the promise of talking about some cultural developments and sort of, we're going to talk a little bit this evening about sort of what's happening in our country and in our world. And for my portion, so what we'll do tonight is I'll speak for a little while. I won't be too long. And Dr. Reynolds, who we'll introduce in just a few moments, he'll come up and he'll talk for a little while longer. And then we'll take some time to have some questions and talk amongst ourselves here. So if you have any questions, surely I will say things which will leave you baffled and curious and maybe even distraught. So just keep those things in mind, and when we get to the end, we can talk about those things. I'm really going to address 3 points this evening, 3 sort of, I think, maybe even somewhat disturbing cultural developments that we should be keeping our eyes on as Christians and as citizens. Those are going to be the following: the centralization of education. I'll go over that in more detail. The decline of the middle class, and attacks on religious liberty and free speech. So we'll talk about each of those 3 things, just in not a whole lot of detail. I'll leave you unsatisfied, but we'll at least get the topic started. The centralization of education. It seems like ages ago, when I was in graduate school, I wrote a dissertation on sort of religious conservative critiques of public education policy, and I had a whole chapter devoted to just sort of the history of the public school, how it got to be the way it was. And that study was actually, I found it very fascinating. A couple of things just relevant to our discussion tonight. I won't recap all that because that's like a 45-minute talk and it's very boring. But I will say this, just to kind of the structures that we know and understand today. The Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education was, believe it or not, some of you this will not sound old to you. It was founded in 1979. It's not ancient history. I was alive, for crying out loud. Jimmy Carter was the president, accomplisher of so many great deeds. From that time, so I picked that date because in some ways you might sort of peg that as sort of the beginning of the sort of the federalization of education, right? So that's 1917. 1979. Flash forward to 2013. In 2013, the last year I could find good data on the budget, $69.8 billion budget in the U.S. Department of Education. It's a lot of money for, frankly, a level of government that's not technically responsible for public education. What do they spend the money on? It turns out they spend it on a lot, and this is, I'm doing a little smoke and mirrors here, because it turns out 1979 is really not the beginning of the federalization of education. It really goes back further. You could go back to the beginning of the 1900s, but a critical moment came in 1965. Lyndon Johnson, some of you may have heard of him, was the president, and he sort of shepherded through Congress a bill known as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the ESEA. And that was a bill that was simply an attempt to get local school districts federal money to support their programs. The idea being that on the surface that might sound fine, but the point, in fact, was, of course, to get those school districts kind of addicted to the federal helping hand. That's kind of the point. And I love to quote this. At the actual ceremony where he's signing the bill, Lyndon Johnson did not have a very good filter. Some of you may, if you know of him, you understand what I'm saying. He said the following. Actually, there's no curse word, so I can say this in a crowd like this. He said, in public, we've got the faucet turned on, and they will never get it turned off. He's talking about the faucet of federal money. We'll just we'll glut them, and they'll become more and more dependent. And so you get to 2013, and sure enough, about $70 billion worth of help and aid and assistance that becomes so central to the educational endeavor that many of those districts can't live without it anymore. That turns out, though, might not have been good enough if you're really attempting to centralize the function of education. You might remember more recently in 2002, George W. Bush shepherded through Congress an expansion of that original ESEA called the No Child Left Behind Act. You've probably heard of that. That's a little more recent and famous. The purpose there, of course, was the notion was maybe there's inequality in the system, right? Some districts thrive and produce great students and have great educational opportunities. Others are lagging behind, and so in an attempt to kind of get us caught up and to help us be competitive in some international sense. We need to have more federal influence in those districts that need it more. And so that became kind of as the name implies, right? We want everybody to sort of have the same kind of opportunities. And so regardless of what it costs, we will make sure that those districts get some kind of leveling opportunity. And then even more recently, and I'll bet some of you in this room, not only have you heard of it, you've grit your teeth and shake your head and maybe even grumble. The Common Core is sort of the most recent effort by the federal government, and even not just the federal government, the National Governors Association, in fact, is involved. Really traces its roots to the 1990s, but formed a formal organization in 2009 to bring forward a set of standards that every school in America can use. And I say can as if it's voluntary. The plan is actually to attach the federal money to compliance with the standards, so that, in effect, either you forego all of your federal money or you conform to the Common Core. And if you know much about the Common Core, of course, it's the nature of education, right? There's no such thing as sort of value-neutral education. Education always has a worldview attached. And in this case, there is a worldview attached to the Common Core. It's one that probably many of us probably wouldn't share with the authors of the core, but it really now has the potential to become a kind of standardized education across districts, states, every part of the country, ends up sort of teaching to the same set of principles, the same collective tests. When I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about this evening, the reason this even popped into my head was about a week ago. It's a little announcement. Unless you pay really close attention, you probably wouldn't even notice or care about such things. But the College Board, you've heard of them. Those are the people who make the SAT exam, and they have a few other kinds of standardized tests they do as well. They hired a new director, a new leader, a guy named David Coleman. That name hopefully means nothing to you. David Coleman was one of the architects of the Common Core. In fact, he wrote the English core standards and was the head of that committee I told you that formed in 2009. Having finished the core, he was looking for work. He goes to work at the College Board to do what? To reconceive the SAT to conform with the Common Core. Why would you do that? I can tell you why you do that. The schools I'm talking about receiving the federal money, of course, are public schools, right? Private schools and homeschoolers are kind of immune to the core, the Common Core, if they choose to be. But if you want your son or daughter to be successful in getting into college now, if all the college exams sort of require the Common Core, maybe even now private schools and homeschoolers and others will have to get involved, will have to be on board, or you risk selling out your own child when it comes to higher education. So it's not an accident, of course, that the architect of the core also now becomes the architect of the new SAT. And as the SAT changes, you watch the others will fall in line, the ACT and others will follow the same sort of alignment. That should be enough, and that's, if you leave here sad and unhappy, it's kind of my fault, I apologize. That might be enough to do it. I'm always reminded of that beautiful verse in Proverbs, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. It's as though now, though, the sort of our own government seems to think that train up a child in the way the government says he should go. And as though there is sort of one way that's done for every child. The beauty of education in America, I think until the last generation, has been that it has been sort of tailored to communities and to even sometimes individual classrooms that have their own unique needs. Not so much so going forward from this day on if we allow the Common Core to take sort of a deeper root. So that's point number one. That's sort of the first cultural development that we should be keeping our eyes on. The second one is maybe more important in some ways, but also more subtle, the decline of the middle class. Let me give you just a couple of numbers here. Your eyes can glaze over. That's fine. Mine would too if I were in your seat. These are horrible terms. The median household income in the United States. You know what median? That's sort of, if you take all of the households, their incomes, and line them up. The median is the one in the middle of the row, like the absolute middle. Some person, some family, that's them. They're there. That's their income. The median income in 2011 was $49,103. I don't know if that sounds high, low. If you adjust for inflation, and of course you must, right, because the inflation controls the purchasing power of that money, right? So that $49,103 is actually less, slightly, than the median household income in 1989, 21 years earlier, 22 years earlier. Think about that for a second. Right? We should not have a generation go by where the median income actually goes down. And if you want to sort of compare to a more recent number, as recently as the year 2000, just 11 years early, sort of splitting the difference, that number from 2011 is 4,000 less than the median income in the year 2000. There's a very clear drop in sort of the middle. So just to understand, at the other ends, they really haven't changed that much. The wealthy are still wealthy, the poor are still poor. It's the middle class that is experiencing the drop in income. Now, maybe that matters to you, maybe it doesn't. I suppose if you're living in desperate poverty, do you care what the middle class is doing? Maybe you don't. If you are sitting in your country club looking out over your minions who are, I don't know, doing what. Maybe you don't care either, but most of us do care, probably to some degree. I'll bet just about everybody in this room probably qualifies as something like middle class, somewhere in that range. So that's us, in a certain sense. The generation that I'm a part of, and many of you in this room are a part of, sort of that millennial generation, that Generation X, is the first generation, think about this for a second, in American history to end up with a lower standard of living than their parents. Think of all that's happened in America. It includes, by the way, the Great Depression, right? The recovery from the Great Depression was such that it overcame the loss, right? But no, we did not, and so I'm sorry for those of you who are younger. It's sort of my fault, at least partly. And that sounds, so if we sort of compare some of those recent numbers, 2011 to 2089, those are disturbing or worrisome. If you go back a little further, this is worth just a little thought experiment here. Look at the sort of the 1950s and 60s, when almost in some ways the high watermark of the middle class in America. A couple of things happened there that really kind of stimulated or was responsible for a big chunk of that growth of the middle class in that period, that 20-year span. The GI Bill, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, right, allowed many, many more people to attend college than had ever attended before. Produced a kind of professionalization of the workforce, right? Lots of now educated workers, people who are, the sons of bakers and steel workers became accountants and engineers, right? So there's and with that, of course, comes a different standard of living, right? And it was experienced by a much larger group of people than ever before. At the same time, you're going to think, what's he talking about? The interstate highway system, what's that got to do with anything? The interstate highway system made it possible. Think about what happens here in Houston, right? How many of you take an interstate to get to work? I'll bet there's at least some of you in this room who do that, right? It became possible to get the cheap real estate out in what became the suburbs, and effectively you could really live there and really get to work in the city. Think about that. Before the interstate system, that was kind of hard to do in many places. It became much simpler, much more feasible. Starting in the 1960s or so. And so that was another way to kind of, that generation experienced a big leap forward in the standard of living, even the middle class, right? You didn't have to be wealthy to take advantage of those things. Now, they have another generation, right? So that sort of the World War II generation, of course, they have a lot of babies. You probably heard this, right? And they're called, that next generation is called the baby boom generation, right? There were a lot of them. Baby boomers, they had a jump, a leap forward in standard of living as well, but not for the same reasons, right? You can expand the highway system, but you can't make it from scratch more than once, right? You can start it only one time. And so the big splash was really the previous generation. So that can't be it, right? The GI Bill, look, you can only sort of move everybody into college one time. College now is sort of standard. You can only make it standard for one generation, and everybody else can only match that, essentially, right? So it's not higher rates of college attendance. It's not better transportation that allowed their standard of living to go up. Some of you this is going to resonate with you, right? They became two-income households. Many, many mothers went to work in that generation, in larger numbers than we'd ever seen in American history before. And so they experienced a jump in their standard of living, but they also worked harder as a family, right? So now two people involved in the income earning. Now, those baby boomers, some of you have heard this, also had children of their own. That became sort of what we call Generation X, and I think I'm kind of part of it. I kind of feel bad about that. It just rubs me the wrong way, but it is true. Generation X, like I said, experiences actually a drop in standard of living, really the first time ever. And so you might ask yourself why that is. In many ways, they can't replicate look, again, we can only send our wives to work once, right? She can't now get two jobs. Actually, maybe she could. we can only match what the previous generation did, and in that sense, only keep up, right? So we moved to the suburbs too, like everybody else did. We go to college like everybody else did. Our wives work like everybody else did. But that's about it, right? So we can only maybe match that. But notice I said there's actually a demonstrable decline in the standard of living of this generation. It's worth sort of thinking about how did that happen? Where does this decline come from? There's a couple of factors that weigh into this, and they're very important, often overlooked. The introduction of no-fault divorce laws, right? Making it easier for families to split up. What do you think that produces? Exactly, more families will split up, precisely. Now you get a lot of one-income families, where there had been two, right? Now, and that's lots of reasons why that's bad, but it's also economically bad, among other things, right? So we shouldn't be terribly surprised. You know how many, I was trying to find this, I didn't look in the right spot, I suppose. Just the sheer volume of single-parent families in Generation X forward dwarfs that of previous generations. And so again, we shouldn't expect that they would experience a standard of living that was equal to their parents because they live a much different kind of life. Now, part of that, I say divorce laws, part of that is also it's government policy, right? How does the welfare system work throughout that time period? Essentially, it pays you to be a single parent, right? If you are married and having children, your access to most of those welfare programs is severely limited. As long as you're unmarried, you get greater benefits. So there's literally this perverse incentive in government policy encouraging people to have babies out of wedlock. And guess what my generation did? Took them up on it. Living in a lower standard of living because of it, but you know, what are you going to do? When the government subsidizes something, you tend to get more of it. In this case, we get more single-parent families. There's another factor that operates in this case, though, and my grandfather is a case in point. My grandfather worked for one company essentially his entire life. He got a job shortly after the war. He was a World War II veteran. After the war, he came back home, put it around a little bit, but then took a job at a company that he stayed at till the day he retired. And that was a pretty common experience in his generation. I have some friends, even now, some older friends in our church who kind of look at me and shake their heads because I've had 5 different jobs in my adult life. What, are you crazy? What's wrong with you? Is he some kind of vagabond? He can't hold a job? What's wrong with this guy? It's not that uncommon, right, as the generations move on, to change positions, to change jobs. One big reason for that, and there may be a number of factors, but there's a really compelling reason for this. The company my grandfather worked for was a publicly traded corporation, like many, many others are. In fact, many Americans work in that kind of environment on some level or other, right? Maybe not in the sort of the executive suite, but think about the number of people who work in publicly traded corporations. It's a lot. In the 1980s especially, there was kind of a redefinition of what we meant by and how we measured the function of corporations. As I said, the expectation in the past was that if you landed that job, you probably had it until the day you retired. By the way, even if you weren't necessarily terribly good at it, right? Well, you might not get bumped up the chain, but you're not going to get bumped out either, right? This is not how we do business. It's just not the right way to do things. So there was a kind of complacency that happened in a lot of those corporations, and the workforce suffered for it, like the efficiency of it suffered for it. Now, if you're the worker, that's a great deal. If you're the shareholder, it doesn't seem like such a great deal. You understand the problem there, right? I have stock in this company. Boy, they could do a lot better if they would just, right, be more efficient in how they use their workers. And so there was this great pressure, especially in the 80s, to sort of reimagine what we think of as employment, right? You don't necessarily now expect lifetime employment because, frankly, we're not going to give it to you. If something needs to change, we're changing it. And if that means you lose your job, you lose your job. And we will not feel guilty about it. You can go find another one somewhere else, probably. Maybe, right? And by the way, probably even, right? Most Americans don't stay unemployed for the rest of their lives. But they can go a long time. What's happening in Houston even as we speak, right? You can go a long time, and your family may suffer a bit during that interim while you seek that new position. And that new position probably doesn't match your old salary in many cases, right? So what happens in sort of the restructuring, corporations did 2 things. They began to think differently about what an employee was and what was expected and how that would be, how responded to. But also, in the period from the 50s and 60s up to the 80s, the notion was every corporation should be a conglomerate, should have lots of diverse interests and create all sorts of different kinds of products to kind of insulate itself, in a volatile market. starting in the 80s, the notion became, we can't be good at all those different things. We're good at something, and we will do that thing. And then when that thing ceases to be a thing, we will move on to another thing, and we'll get good at that thing. And what happens, of course, with technology and advances that happen rapidly, especially in that time frame to today, right? Big changes happen quickly. Corporations have become more nimble. But that means that sometimes the workers who are there don't really have a place in the newly imagined corporation, right? We moved from product X to product Y. You're a specialist in product X. We're hiring new people to do product Y. I'm sorry, but you will have to go find work elsewhere. Again, it's America. You probably find work elsewhere eventually, after maybe having been unemployed for a while. But what does that do across your lifetime if that happens 2 or 3 times, right? You're downsized on maybe several occasions even, right? That probably impacts your total earning over your lifetime, right? That's just not terribly surprising. When you start to map out exactly how much that affected Americans in the 80s and 90s, it turned out to be a lot, and especially in the middle class, right? The executives don't really have that experience as much as the middle. By the way, I'm not saying this to complain, actually. Again, from the point of view of the shareholder, I definitely understand, right? If I'm an investor, I don't want to hear that you're sort of, helping employees along and you're going to help them kind of, they stink at the job or whatever. Hey, that's my money you're wasting there. And I don't want to hear that you became, I have a thumb in every pie and I don't know how to make 20 of them, but I'm going to put my thumb in it anyway, right? If I'm the shareholder, I want you to generate value, right? And by the way, that's pretty much what happened. Corporations became more valuable. They did generate more value. So in one sense, it's a winning situation, but who benefits from the winning? Largely that was the upper class during that time period, right? So what's happening, sort of picture it in your mind, right? The middle class does experience a drop in its standard of living. And if anything, the upper class experiences an increase in its standard of living, which was already kind of high. So the gap begins to widen. Gaps of that sort are not necessarily bad. They've kind of always been. That's why we call them the upper and the middle class, right? There's always a gap. There's never not been a gap. Otherwise, we'd only have one class. But the changing gap, if it's the middle class that's shrinking, right, and it's experiencing some people fall out of it, literally, out of it into the, you can't say lower class, that just sounds so offensive, right? I don't know what we call them, poverty-stricken or something.
The upwardly mobile.
Upwardly mobile, they hope, right? So this leaves us with, though, I want you to really, really think about this point. The promise of America, almost from its inception, I mean, you can go back to the colonial period, right? Why did people leave, in some cases, very comfortable situations back in the old country, right? Sometimes not, but some of those Puritans who came over and founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony were pretty well off even. They weren't scoundrels, they weren't desperately poor. They had a good situation, but they came anyway, right? And even those who did maybe come from desperate situations had the expectation things would get better. And that has sort of been part of the DNA of America pretty much from its beginning and continuously throughout. We have this expectation things will get better for us. Think about the immigrant groups, all those Italians, those Germans, those Irish who in the middle 19th century and early 20th century came over in droves. The expectation was, I'm gonna work hard and it's gonna be tough, but boy, my kids are gonna have it better than I did. That's almost every parent's expectation. Not even dream, really. We kind of really think it's going to happen. But what if demonstrably it doesn't happen? And now we don't even have an expectation of it happening. What's America without the expectation of success and prosperity? France. It might be, France or something maybe even worse, right? This might take a while to work itself out, but I'll be careful how I say this. I don't mean this as a criticism. I don't mean it as an affirmation. It's just an observation. I think we see the beginnings of that problem, that disaffected group, in the Donald Trump candidacy, right? What's he tapped into? A group of people who feel like they've been let down. And kind of, in a sense, they have. So here, third point then, or sort of the third item cultural development we should be keeping on, attacks on religious liberty. Maybe you've noticed this, I don't know. In 2015, so just a few months ago, this was a fairly recent poll, Pew Research, very reputable polling company, did a poll of generations, different generations, asking about all sorts of sort of cultural issues. One of them was freedom of speech and offensive speech. And when asked, should the First Amendment be repealed or changed to allow the government to regulate offensive speech? So think about that. We don't need free speech because we've got to control the offensive speech. 41% of millennials said yes. And that's, by the way, it's not a majority, but it is the plurality. There were other choices, and the most commonly selected choice was First Amendment is a problem because we have too much offensive speech. So when I say a tax on free speech, you understand, we have almost an entire generation who doesn't value free speech. I mean, if you have to, I'm a big fan of freedom of religion myself, actually, but if you had to sort of, what's America's favorite liberty among, we love them, right? They're all good. We've got a whole list of them. Boy, freedom of speech is a really big one. To somehow get very quickly to a generation that says, yeah, but people say mean things and we should stop them. That happened fast. And something to be concerned about. Some of you, one or two of you maybe, in this room, are old enough to remember some of the religious wars of the 1960s and 70s. Many of these end up in the Supreme Court, battles over, can you actually read from the Bible at the start of the school day in a public school? Can you, dare I say, pray before the start of a school day? Those were settled in the Supreme Court and almost never in favor of the religious interest, right? I won't be careful, don't tell anybody this, but this is a true story. My first tenure-track job out of graduate school was in a place called Lee University in eastern Tennessee, in a county with a school district where they started school with prayer every day, like it's the land that time forgot. And I even said to somebody, the Supreme Court said that's illegal. I'm happy, right, go ahead and do it, but the Supreme Court's not here. Yeah. That was kind of their thought, right? It's the Bible Belt, you can do that. I don't know if they're still doing it. That was quite some time ago now. But generally speaking, we saw the purging, right, of religious influences from our public schools. And always with recourse to this thought, we don't want to violate the establishment clause of the First Amendment, right? Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. And if we read from a Bible in a public school, we're establishing a religion. Now, if you go back, you don't have to do this very long. You spend 10 minutes looking at some of the primary sources, you'll see that was not what the founders were worried about. That wasn't the thing they meant when they said Congress shall make no. They literally meant establishing a religion. And one of the reasons I know this is because many state governments at the time had established religions. Like legally, the state supports it. And notice the language of the Constitution of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law. They didn't want the national government doing it. They didn't want the national government essentially trumping the states. It was a way of protecting states that already had established churches so they could, you ready for this, keep their established churches. That does not mean don't read a Bible to school, right? That's clearly different. But that doesn't really matter because there's a redefinition happening there, right? What we mean by the Establishment Clause changed a lot in the 1970s or so. I bring this up because, that's ancient history, the 70s. Huh? I bring it up because something very much like that is now happening with the Free Exercise Clause, I think. What we always sort of thought of sort of our last defense, surely I can that's the second part, right? Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment or restricting the free exercise thereof. So I've got that trump card. I don't mean that as a pun, I meant that. I have that, so always my defense. Yeah, but maybe free exercise doesn't mean what you thought it meant. Maybe free exercise just means sort of what you do privately behind closed doors, right? So what you do in your church on Sunday or in your home, when nobody else is around, that's free exercise. But what happens in public is not free, right? There's a public interest that trumps your free exercise. We're seeing, I think, that kind of thinking begin to permeate our culture. I'll give you just a couple of quick examples here. Some of you will understand what I'm getting at here. If you are, I mentioned the bakers earlier, if you are you've heard this, right? If you bake cakes for a living and you're a Christian and you maybe don't want to do business with certain people because of, say, their sexual orientation. I'm sorry, that's a public market now. See, you keep the religion's a private thing. You have free exercise. Don't bake a cake for them in your home and serve it to them. Don't invite them over, I guess. But in your shop, you must serve them because it's a public enterprise now. You see the difference there? Now, again, complete redefinition of what we meant by free exercise. Again, I assure you, that's not what the founders really had in mind, but I don't know that it matters much in the current context. Another sort of famous example, you've probably heard this one too. If you own maybe some apartments, you're a landlord and you're a Christian, right? And you don't want to rent your properties to certain people because of the lifestyle that they have. Well, again, no, that's a public enterprise you're engaged in. You do need to accommodate them maybe. Again, religion is fine, but must be private, right? Your free exercise belongs at home. If you start to apply that logic in a broad, and I think that's what we're seeing, right? I think we're sort of seeing it begin to seep out into other areas. I gave you 2 examples, but we're seeing more and more of it. What are some of the next steps? Do churches really need to be tax exempt? I mean, for many of us, that seemed like maybe a total third rail. That could never happen. But I'm not so sure.
I guess they do need
I didn't even know there was rain in the forecast. Do churches really need to be taxed? Taxation is kind of a public thing, right? They can still have their religion. They can have their free exercise, but maybe they need to pay their fair share, right? How about maybe even more immediate, the hiring practices of churches, of religious schools, religious organizations, right? What if they don't want to hire practicing homosexuals, right? Employment's kind of a public thing. Again, we haven't quite gotten there, but those seem to be the next frontiers for us. I think we're going to see serious challenges to the tax-exempt status and the hiring practices of churches and religious groups. When I think of free speech and religious liberty, free speech is in many ways also being sort of changed to fit sort of the public, right? So this speech you can make in public must be non-offensive. You can talk what you want behind closed doors. Your religion needs to sort of fit the public expectation. You can do it privately at home and have your free exercise, right? But you can't do it publicly. That sort of seems to be the new interpretation of religious liberty and free speech. There's lots more I could say, but I think I will stop here for now because I just want to make sure I leave enough time for Dr. Reynolds, who's much more interesting than I am, in fact. But those are the 3 sort of critical cultural trends that really have me concerned. And look, I've given you no answers. Did you catch that? Like, I just left you with nothing but bad news. I hope it works out well for you, though. And with that, I'm going to turn the podium over to Dr. Reynolds.